Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Shannon Miller and I'm one of the 2 Athenaeum Fellows this year. Google has probably done more to shape the modern world than any other business or government. Our speaker tonight, Jonathan Rosenberg, has probably done more to shape Google than anyone but its founders. If you don't believe me, you can Google it. Jonathan Rosenberg, who graduated from CMC in 1983, is the current advisor to Google CEO Larry Page. Prior to his role, he was the Senior Vice President of Product Management, overseeing the design, creation, and improvement of Google's innovative product portfolio. Before joining Google in 2002, Rosenberg founded, led, and managed some of the most innovative product development teams of the Internet's first era. With Google Executive Chairman Eric Schmidt, Rosenberg authored How Google Works, The Rules for Success in the Internet Century, of which everyone in this room has a copy. Which details the business and management lessons that Rosenberg and Schmidt learned as they helped build the most important company of the modern era. As always, audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming John Rosenberg to the Ath.
Well, so that was a nice introduction. When I sat down at my table, I heard something different. These students look at me like they don't know who I am, and they say, "Have you ever spoken here before?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like 4 years ago. I give a talk in 2010. You can look it up. It's called Jonathan's Rules for Success in the Internet Century," right? Have any of you watched it? Yeah, well, all the old people in the room. You know, I should just come every 4 years and give the same talk. Isn't that what professors do? Or what, USC, isn't that what USC professors do? I was in Jeff's lecture this morning. He changes it up all the time. So in that talk, I kind of presented myself as Google's Alexis de Tocqueville, and I recited a bunch of rules. You know, repetition doesn't spoil the prayer. Focus on the user. Do all reorgs in a day. And people actually liked it. And so I came back to Google, and Eric said, "Well, you know, Jonathan, if it was such a good talk, we should write a book." And I was like, "Well, this is going to be easy. Here you go, Eric. The talk's in my pocket." And he says, "No, Jonathan, a good book." So he found us a publisher. And of course, the publisher said, "You know, Jonathan, you can't just write down notes from all the smart people you meet in Silicon Valley in the world and go out and publish it and hope that it's going to be a bestseller. You actually need the stuff like one of the students mentioned to me, her English professor says. You need a thesis. You need a beginning. You need a middle. You need an end. You need a narrative. You actually need to do some work." So I was like, well, bummer, but I've already said to Eric that I'm going to do this book. So today's talk is not the 2010 Rules for Success revisited. Rather, if it were a Star Wars movie, this would be the prequel to that talk. It's the underlying dynamics and market forces that necessitated a very different way of thinking in Silicon Valley about how we build products and how we innovate. And also, how we attract a fundamentally different type of employee. And once we've attracted that kind of employee, how do we think about culture? And how do we think about strategy? And how do we think about decision-making and communication and innovation fundamentally differently than the way we have in the past? So to understand those dynamics, I want to take you on kind of the quick thought journey of my career in big 5-year increments. So I got out of business school in 1985. Thank you, Jerry, for the recommendation to the University of Chicago. I never would have gotten in based on the grades I earned in your classes. But I got out of business school, and I came to Silicon Valley and worked for a startup company. And the first thing that happens is my boss comes in, it's 1985, and he puts an IBM PC XT on my desk. And I like stare at it. It has a 10 megabyte EverX hard drive and a Diablo daisy wheel printer, and this is all supposed to be cool. I have no idea what to do with it. So it sits there. About a year later, we get an admin right out of college, and she sees me typing envelopes to the 75 customers that we now have. And she looks at me and she says, you know, there's a product called Mail Merge from Microsoft that you can use with that IBM PC, and you could print mailing labels, and you'd never have to do this again. I was like, well, that's pretty cool. And of course, over the next 5 years, the PC became an integral part of my life. Same thing happens 5 years later. Boss comes in, he says, you've got email. And I was like, why do I need email? He's like, well, I can tell you what to do with it much faster. So I was like, okay. And of course, then over the next 5 years, I adopt email. It becomes an important part of my life. Same thing 5 years later. I'm at Apple, and we're using a proprietary online service called eWorld, which is based on American Online technology. And the internet comes along, and there's browsers and open standards, and people are really excited about this. And I'm like, well, why would I want that? I have all of the information I could possibly want in the world. It's all like right here in AOL. Why would I want to go anywhere else? 5 years later, 2000, I'm happy with my Motorola StarTech phone. Somebody shows up with a BlackBerry and says, you can send email and message people with a phone. And I'm like, why would I want to do that? 5 years later, I'm at Google, and Eric Schmidt's talking about cloud computing. You're going to have all your content in the cloud. And I'm like, I have all of my content right here on my IBM ThinkPad where I know it, and I like it that way. 5 years later, we're talking about robot cars and wearable devices. And again, things have evolved in ways that I couldn't possibly have predicted. But what did I do? I took all the principles that I'd learned at business school, and I tried to apply them to this world that I now realized you couldn't predict. And I showed up at Google, and I wrote very rigid and very structured product plans that articulated what the world was going to look like in 5 years. But by my own admission, I was a guy who could never see more than about 6 months into the future. So Larry told me, let's come up with a fundamentally different way of thinking about products and doing product plans. And I think what I realized then is that we're at a very profound moment in history where the architecture of the way most companies are structured and the way most professionals in business think is specifically designed to slow things down in this moment when everything is speeding up. And to understand why that matters, let me, since I'm at CMC, go back and give you a little bit of a basic economics lesson. There's 3 big trends that are fundamentally changing everything: the internet, mobile, and cloud. Now, why do I choose those things? I choose those things because they make something free that used to cost money. The internet makes information free. Mobile makes reach, the ability for companies to reach consumers and the abilities for people to communicate with each other, free. And cloud computing makes computing resources practically free. Now, why is that important? Somewhere in Econ 52, somebody teaches you the factors of production, right? What are the factors of production? You can guess if you don't. There you go, capital, right? Well, capital's easy. You can go get that on Sand Hill Road. What else? Physical labor. I'm going to change it a little, but physical labor. And do we need Brock Blomberg? Land. Okay, land, physical labor, and capital, right? So these things cost money, and people manage them as though they're scarce. But suddenly now we're in this world where information, reach, and computing power are free and abundant. And the way in which you manage a company and the way in which you manage production fundamentally changes when the inputs into the production function are free and abundant as opposed to when they cost a lot of money. The second big thing that's changed is everything is moving much, much faster, particularly the way the world adopts what economists in their sort of unsexy lingo, they would have all gone farther if they had sexy terms for things, but they call them general purpose technologies, okay? General purpose technologies in history are things like steam or electricity or today the internet. They're inventions that fundamentally completely change the landscape. But if you look historically at these inventions, you look at steam. It took 150 years after the steam engine was produced to pump water out of flooded mines before we conquered the West with the railroads and went through the Industrial Revolution. It took electricity at least 30 years before the whole generation of people who ran steam plants and powered factories with steam started to adopt electricity. So all of these big changes took lots of time. But what happened with the internet? 1995, here we have TCP/IP, we have a browser, and we have HTML. These three things come together, and boom, we have companies that are usurping the place of some of the largest firms in business. So things are happening much, much faster. But what else is happening? The tools that people use to build products in these companies have been completely democratized. We've got open source software. We've got abundant APIs. We've got much more robust protocols than we had years ago. And we've got sets of information that anyone can have access to. We've got all the information on the internet, but more importantly, we've got ratings information about companies. We've got information about stock transactions. We've got information about traffic. And what's very important about all of these information sets, if you go back to your economics lesson, they're what we would call in economics a non-rival good. Anybody know, what's your classic in your economics textbooks examples of a non-rival good? Nobody? We're going to have to call on Brock. Did somebody say a park? Okay, like a park, right? So non-rival goods are things that don't get used up as one firm or one individual consumes them. So suddenly, you've got all of these tools that have been democratized based on a set of content that actually doesn't get used up. That's the way I think about what's going on in the factory. But now let's go to the other side of the equation. What's going on with consumers? All of this free information has completely shifted the balance of power. It used to be that the balance of power was with the big company. You could spend lots of marketing money and overwhelm the consumer by dint of dollars to tell them that your products were better. But now that information is free, that's not possible. And when that happens, the big shift is that products become much more important because people will actually tell and will share with each other when the products suck and when they don't. And you don't need all of this marketing money. Think about products that take off today. Instagram, WhatsApp, Angry Birds. These things take off by virtue of being great products and by virtue of people sharing them with each other. So the hits take off and products matter more than companies. What else matters? Individuals. It used to be it took very large teams to build sets of product functionality. But today, individuals can have much more impact. Again, they're leveraging and building on these non-rival goods and these sets of information and then getting them out to users much more expeditiously than they had in the past. And in the book, we come up with a name for these people. We call them smart creatives. A smart creative is the type of technical person who has strong technical skills but also has some elements of business savvy and is extremely passionate. The subset of smart creatives that can actually build products out of information, reach, connectivity, and computing power become the paramount, what you would call in economics, complementary scarce resource. If you go back to what Bill Gates said about why he went to Microsoft in the early 1980s, he said, the price of computing was coming way down, so I decided to go into software. So the same thing is true today with these smart creatives. The kind of people who can build products out of these resources that are now almost free are the ones that are actually going to have the most impact. But how are companies structured? Companies are structured the way we were taught they should be structured when resources were expensive and scarce, right? When you had to go through gates to get allocated more resources to prove that your products were actually going to be successful, when it was difficult to prototype product functionality. So the architecture and the management models that most of us are taught are specifically designed to slow these people down, and smart creatives chafe at that kind of structure. So what we learned we needed to do was develop a different approach to managing this new animal and helping these people scale, effectively staying out of their way and helping them understand the vision for what they were trying to accomplish so that they could actually go build product functionality. So let me tell you a story about the second month I was at Google. It was the spring of 2002, and we were trying to figure out how to make AdWords better. And we were off to Madison Avenue, and everybody said, you know, nobody wants to buy those silly little text ads. And we were trying to make them better. And they weren't as well targeted as they needed to be, but they were running on the service. And Larry was in his office on one Friday afternoon, and I was out somewhere on Friday afternoon. I probably shouldn't have been, but I was. And Larry discovers a bunch of ads that aren't working. So what does he do? He goes and he prints out the ads. He was actually running ads on H1B. He was looking for an H1B Kawasaki motorcycle, which thankfully he didn't buy, and he's still here. He was getting ads for H1B lawyers who wanted to help people who wanted H1B visas, right? Clearly, if you're looking for an H1B Kawasaki motorcycle, you're not interested in an H1B visa, but he was getting ads for that, and other ads that weren't very good. So Larry goes, and he prints out all of the ads that aren't working, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sticks them all up in the kitchen with little yellow stickies. And on the little yellow stickies, it says, "These ads suck." That's it. Then he goes home. I'm not even in the office. What would normally happen in most companies when the CEO or founder sees something like this? They'd call a meeting, they'd schedule the meeting, they'd bring the product people into the room, they'd bring the engineering people into the room, somebody would hatch a plan, somebody would define a time frame in which it could be done, people would sit around and argue, and maybe months later something would be fixed. This isn't actually what happened at Google. 5 a.m. the following Monday, I got an email from Jeff Dean, who's still at Google, by the way. He and a bunch of engineers who were on the search team, not the ads team, had been coding all weekend, and they'd created something they called a query snippet vector, which I had a lot of difficulty understanding, but basically, it looked at the pages that would come up relative to the query and asked whether or not the ads that were being proposed pointed to those pages. And if they did, it deemed that they were actually good ads. Not only did they have this idea, they'd written a prototype, and the prototype was running. They weren't even on the ads team, yet they'd actually spent the weekend doing this. And when they came in, the people who were on the ads team cheered. They were actually happy that their colleagues on the search team had helped them. That was when it became clear to me that culture mattered in a way at Google that I'd never seen it matter before. And I'd been at other companies where they try to get culture right. And it's always the same thing. They're busy starting the company, and then sometime they have a little bit of success and they decide, well, now we need to define our culture. So they go get some HR person who wasn't there in the beginning, and they say, you know, go write the culture, right? Well, that always comes out the same. It comes out something like, to build unrivaled partnerships with our clients through the sheer dedication, hard work, and perseverance of our wonderful employees to maximize shareholder value. If you run a Google search on that or something fairly close to it, you'll get Lehman Brothers, right? If you type in respect, integrity, communication, and excellence, you'll find Enron, right? That's not actually how you want to build culture. You want to start culture from the beginning. And you want to start it in a way that manifests itself with a set of selection bias that causes the kind of people who espouse the culture that you do to join your team. And we then take these people and we put them in very small shared environments. We've learned that small teams, again, with these new tools, can get a lot more done than large teams. But small teams, although they have some social controls, they also bicker and fight. So we invented a bunch of rules for how we were going to manage these small teams. The first was we weren't going to allow what we call hippos. Hippos, if you read the book, are highest paid person's opinion. It's probably no coincidence that the word bloat, which is sort of onomatopoetic for a bunch of middle-aged managers sitting around telling junior smart creatives what to do, sounds like blow, right? Because they don't get anything done. But we wanted to free these people and create an environment where they would be successful working with each other. And we came up with some of these principles. One of them is exile nights and fight for divas. When people are working together in very small, tight-knit environments, what happens is it's miserable if you have someone who's a knave, someone who lies, cheats, steals, someone who spills in the kitchen and doesn't clean it up. So as managers, we focused on getting rid of those people as quickly as we possibly could. But the other thing that we noticed in Silicon Valley is there's another category of people that these small teams actually try to drive out. And these we call the divas, people like Steve Jobs. It turns out that there are a set of these people that are just plain better than the rest of us. And so you want to manage an environment that puts up with these people in these small sets of teams if they're actually able to fundamentally produce much better functionality. We also developed very different approaches to thinking about strategy. It used to be that the strategic plans, if you read Michael Porter or if you go to business school, or which they probably teach you here so you don't have to go to business school, are, develop something for the innovators and early adopters, and then ride the cost curves down and build economies of scale so that you can lock in customers and generate value kind of the way sort of Michael Porter competitive advantage would dictate. But that takes a lot more structure and time than is actually going to work today. So we came up with an approach to strategic planning that was much more fluid. We defined the foundation for these smart creatives, but then we turned them loose because we learned we couldn't actually dictate the one thing that matters in the product cycle. The one thing that matters is what we call a technical insight. It's the kind of thing that actually manifests itself in the product that makes the product better, right? In Google with search, it was PageRank. With ads, it was price times the click-through rate so that the ads actually had value. With Gmail, it was lots of storage. With Maps, it was kind of a mirror on the world. And technical insights are not unique to Google. Lots of other companies have technical insights. Pixar, we can tell a movie with computers, right? What's another? Bed Bath & Beyond. How many of your parents show up at school and you all go to Bed Bath & Beyond to collect the gear that you signed up for at home, right? Yeah, see, we did that. So that's a technical insight. We're going to use the IT infrastructure that we have to fundamentally make the product experience better. All of these technical insights today come out of what we call combinatorial innovation. Okay, combinatorial innovation is the set of things that get put together out of standardized components and parts that drove the previous grand evolutions in manufacturing and production. In the Industrial Revolution, it was the standards of gears, pulleys, shafts, cams, the things that allowed a modern factory to operate much more efficiently. At the turn of the 20th century, it was the internal combustion engine, right? And from that, we had cars and motorcycles and all sorts of other innovations. Today, it's information, computing power, and reach. And when you think about those things, and you think about the growth that comes out of a company that harnesses those things with a technical insight, you start to understand why speed is so much more important. So let me just give you a simple example of that. Take the telephone, the fax, the VCR, Google, eBay, Waze. Look at each of those companies. What are they? They're the connection, they're the synapse that makes information connect to people or people to connect to people. And as they grow, they become much more valuable and powerful very quickly. The phone, one isn't very good if you only have one. If you have two, it's Watson, come here, I need you. And if you have three, it actually becomes useful. Same with the fax. Same with the VCR, which was information to content, or Google, which was information to advertisers, advertisers to information, or Waze, connecting the social graph to maps. So as soon as you start to win with one of these sets of information to information, you get something that has a self-reinforcing dynamic that grows very, very quickly. The other thing that Google did very differently was hiring. We've actually hired some of the people here, Christian at least. But what became clear to me when I started at Google was they thought about hiring very, very differently. And I went to my first interview at Google thinking, well, this is going to be easy. They're like some little startup company, and they don't know what they're doing. And I'm like this big, important executive at Excite at Home. I mean, I'm a senior vice president. They're just going to offer me the job. And of course, I get there, and that's not the case. They put me through like a day of interviews. And then at the end of the day of interviews, there sits Sergey. And he wants to interview me some more. So Sergey asks me a bunch of questions, and I'm exhausted after like 2 hours. And then finally, he asks his favorite question, which is, explain to me something complicated. And I'm like, well, I don't know anything complicated. So I flash back to Jerry Eirich's theory of the firm class, and I start drawing a total cost curve and, average cost and deriving marginal cost and showing, the marginal cost going through the minimum of the average cost curve. Is that right, Ari? You do Q of x over x, you take the first derivative, you set it equal to 0, marginal cost equals average cost at the ladder's minimum or something. You taught me that. So I'm almost done, and I'm very proud of myself. And Sergey's like looking bored. And I realize that I'm doing first-year college calculus with a math Olympian. So I start to panic, and then I think, well, what do I know about that he doesn't? And I think, well, he's sort of disheveled and 25 years old, and I'm middle-aged and married. So I did a sermon on courtship. We've been married for 25 years. So it worked. Why did it work? It worked because all Sergey was really looking for was passion. Passion is the one thing I've learned you can't teach. If people aren't passionate about something, you can't make them passionate about what your business is focused on. But if they are passionate about something, you can teach them culture, you can teach them the company's mission, and you can make them passionate about what you do at your company. So we also learned that when the world is changing as quickly as I articulated at the beginning, you want generalists, not specialists. And that's a very different approach to hiring. Why do you want generalists and not specialists? If you hire a specialist, they're going to attack every problem with their specialty, right? They're going to see every nail as though they're a hammer. You want people who are much more pliant and capable of thinking, actually the kind of people who have a traditional liberal arts education but also have a passion and who also want to go out and develop a technical skill or an understanding of where product functionality is going. The other thing we learned is, particularly early on, you need to hire A's. You can't hire B's. If you hire A's, you can teach them how to hire A's. But if you allow an A to hire a B, then the B becomes very threatened, and B's hire C's. So if you only hire A's, you get the same self-reinforcing effect where all of the people who come to the company are over a certain bar. So you had a very aggressive approach to hiring in the hiring bar. We were also very aggressive about managing more like sports teams do. It always amazed me if you look at coaches of sports teams, like they really care about the people that they recruit, right? They pay a lot more attention than managers in big companies who are just busy focused on filling their head count and getting the first person they can find in the door before they lose their head count. But when you hire great people, you want to feed them the ball, right? I'm in LA, I'd use Kobe Bryant as my example, but since he's not doing so well this year, I'll go back to San Francisco and focus on Stephen Curry. We have Stephen Curry. So what does Steve Kerr do? Why is Steve Kerr a genius? He says, give the ball to Stephen Curry, right? So what do? We give lots more responsibility to the people who actually know what they're doing. And then we invent a different approach to how we're going to run the organization, how we're going to run meetings, and how we're going to make decisions. You're going to go into a lot of companies, and they're going to say, we're consensus-driven, and everybody gets to participate, and all that sort of thing. And then you're going to very quickly discover it isn't true. They have a bunch of hippos who make all the decisions. And it's not the smart creatives, right? Jim Barksdale used to say when he started meetings, if we have data, let's look at data. If we don't, if all we have are opinions, we'll go with mine, right? And that's the way most companies run. So we invented a very structured approach, which Eric named, decide with data, beware the bobble-headed yes, and know when to ring the bell. And that's the way we actually ran meetings. We would have 2 projectors in every room. People would come in, and we'd start the meeting with just the data. And then, what would the hippo do? It was the hippo's job to actually go around the room and ask the people in the room who hadn't participated, who'd been talked over by the more aggressive people in the room who were good at talking, what their opinions were. So you wouldn't let people sit there and just nod. If the people are just sitting there nodding, you keep nodding. You throw them out of the room. That doesn't do you any good. You need them to participate, so you're going to have to ask a question. So you'd beware the bobble-headed yes, and then what would happen when you get really smart creatives in the room, what would happen is they would just argue. And so Eric would tell us, okay, Jonathan, your job, once you get them all arguing, is give them a deadline. Know when to ring the bell. And that was really the structure around which we ran management and management meetings. We also took a very different approach to the way we thought about sharing information and communicating. I'd been at Google for about 3 years. And whenever you're a senior person in an organization with a bunch of smart creatives, they always like wonder why you're there and you get to keep your job because you don't actually do anything. And one of the engineers comes into my office, derisively says to me, you know, Jonathan, you're just an expensive router. For those who don't know computer speak, a router is basically a pretty dumb device. And I thought, well, I could be offended, or I could take it as a compliment. Because I really did go home every night at 10 o'clock and look at all the email that I'd received and ask myself, what information came across my desk that I need to share with other people in the company? And that was the kind of principle that we had in terms of sharing information that was very much unlike any other company that I'd ever worked for. We shared the board slides with all the employees. Had an interesting byproduct, which was people, the managers, instead of, Eric taught me this, because I was in charge of making the board slides for 10 years. He said, well, your colleagues aren't going to be that interested in helping you prepare the slides for the board. But if you tell them that the slides about what they've been doing are going to be shared with all of their employees, maybe they'll spend more time helping you. So we created a tradition where we presented the state of the company to the board, and the next week we actually went through the board slides with all of the employees. So the principle, again, goes back to free information. The employees are going to find all this information out at some point. So at Google, pretty much all information is available on the company intranet all of the time. People also then ask a lot about, okay, so why does this lead to such an innovative culture? What is it that you do that's so innovative? Do you have a chief information officer? In fact, we have exactly the opposite. Yahoo actually hired a guy by the name of Udi Manber many years ago and appointed him chief information officer because they weren't innovative enough. And of course, he looked at the charter of his job and discovered that what they were asking him to do was create an innovation bureaucracy. So he quit, and he came to Google and started working on innovation in search. And what we learned was that innovation is not the job of a chief information officer. It's really the job of the CEO. The CEO needs to create a culture which is going to allow innovation. And most people think of innovation wrong. They think of it because we glorify eureka moments, right? Whenever you're asked when you came up with something, if somebody's an inventor, they'll give you their eureka moment, right? You know, Archimedes in the bathtub trying to see whether or not the crown was pure, discovering that if he pulls it in, it's going to displace more water than if it's fake, starts, you know, running through the streets, eureka, I found it, right? That's his flash of brilliance. And if you read books on innovation, there's a great book by Steve Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From. What you see is even the most brilliant innovations in history, you know, Darwin, what does he say? He doesn't say, like, I was out on the Beagle for years, you know, drawing finches. He says, well, one day I was at home reading Malthus, and, you know, I came up with this idea. But that's not true. If you look at his own notes, you see that the evolution is a set of ideas that have been percolating for a long time. So we learned you can't beat on people and expect them to produce flashes of brilliance. You have to create a loose set of collaborations across teams. And you have to make it easy for those teams to be very aggressive. And that's where Larry talks about thinking big and talks about moonshots and talks about making it okay to fail. If you go to most companies, they say all those things, but they don't actually do them. We have a guy on the Google X team, Astro Teller, and he was asked about a car project that he's working on. And he said, if you ask me to produce a car that gets 70 miles per gallon, that's a project. If you ask me to produce a car that gets 500 miles per gallon, that's a completely different project. And that second project is going to have failures and byproducts that are much more valuable than the project that's aiming at 70 miles per gallon. And that was what really rang with Larry and Sergey that caused them to constantly ask us to set objectives that we were not possibly going to be able to achieve. I learned this after my first year. We had these objectives, and they were green, yellow, and red. You know, you get the colors, right? Green means you did well, red means you screwed up. And I sandbagged all my objectives. So when it came to be the management meeting where you sort of talk about how you did against each of those things, everybody else was like, well, I was green on this and yellow on that and red on that. And I'm like sitting there like, you know, the cat who swallowed the canary. I'm all green this quarter, Sergey. And he looks at me and he says, well, we will declare this a failure of small thinking. And I thought, after I got over myself, that that was very insightful, because the next time I was much more aggressive about my goals. And what did that do? It caused me to stand up in front of my team articulating a bunch of things that I'd failed on. Well, what does that do? It makes it a lot easier for them to set very big goals and to get up and say that they didn't achieve all of their goals. Very, very few companies actually operate that way. I think a lot of people see many of the other principles that we talk about, you know, allocating resources 70, 20, 10, and 20% time, and think that's sort of the magic of what we do. But it really is the ability of people working on 20% time and collaborating with each other, building prototypes much, much more quickly with these information sets that I talked about, where they then are encouraged to show it to other people. And instead of having management look at all of these prototypes, again, we don't do plans. Anybody has an idea, they create a prototype. And once they've created a prototype, we use what we call the first follower principle. If you type in the TED Talk, Derek Silver's TED Talk on first followers, by far the most information, the biggest tell in whether or not an idea or a prototype is any good, is whether or not an engineer is actually able to get other engineers to join her or him on his 20% project. So we have a much more fluid approach to 20% projects. Eric and I often sort of close when we're talking to big companies with how to do strategy. And if you read the book, we have all of these really hard questions about strategy. And ask the 5-year question. Ask yourself how you're going to be attacked by smaller competitors, et cetera, et cetera. And it's always kind of a downer, because the people don't really know how to ask a lot of these hard questions. So I thought what I would do is close on kind of a more optimistic note, since you're students and you've barely gotten started yet. So I'd like to quote really the two greatest historians of the 20th century, who are anybody? That's a good guess. Anybody? No. What's good? Billy Joel and my father. So, you know, Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray, isn't that like where we all learned history these days? So what did Billy Joel say? Billy Joel said, the good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems. Well, think about that. The good old days weren't always good. The good old days were awful. We were largely an agrarian society. We were struggling to eat. We didn't have antibiotics. We couldn't fly down here from Northern California to come give a talk. I couldn't eat raspberries for breakfast in winter, which I just did yesterday. In fact, the good old days sucked. Right? Who said they don't make them like they used to? Like, what were they talking about? Name something for me that you had 20 years ago that's better than you have today. I drove an AMC Matador. Trust me, it was not better. So the good old days sucked, and tomorrow is exciting. So what does my father, who's a professor of economics at Stanford and wrote a lot on the economics of technological change, say about tomorrow? He says, in hindsight, the future is obviously not obvious. Should be like an interview question to parse that statement. But in hindsight, right, looking backwards, the future is obviously not obvious. Well, what was my father talking about? He was talking about all these general purpose technologies that he used to write about. The steam engine, electricity, the laser, the integrated circuit. It was very difficult when these things were initially introduced to the market to see where they would go, right? It took years for all of the complementary inventions to come about that actually made those inventions manifest themselves in ways that fundamentally changed the economy and drove economic progress. So, in hindsight, the future is obviously not obvious. So, here we are, and what's happened for the last 10, 20 years? We've had all these changes that I said in the beginning have sped everything up. What were they? They were Moore's Law, the rates of change of processors improving by an order of magnitude in short periods of time. They were the analogous Kreider's law, which is basically the same thing as Moore's Law except for storage. Similar laws related to bandwidth that are fundamentally improving the rates at which we're all connected to all of these things all of the time. So we close the book by then saying somewhere in a dorm room or a coffee shop or a garage, somebody like you is out to usurp the position of the largest incumbents and start a new business. If you're one of those entrepreneurs, I don't have to ask you to buy my book because you already have it, so I'll ask you to read it. But I'll also ask you to go back to the third person that I have to quote from the 21st century who belongs in the pantheon with Billy Joel and my father, and that's Yoda. Yoda says, try, try not. Do or do not. There is no try. Thank you.